August 1st, 2026. It is just past noon on the West Plains, 10 miles west of downtown Spokane, Washington, and a fire is starting in dry grass. By 8:20 that evening, it is 3,500 acres. By Monday morning, it and the two fires that ignited alongside it cover about 8,000. 8,000 acres, in a summer when 4 fires in Oregon alone are burning nearly 1 million between them, and when another fire in Washington has already taken 134,000 acres. By the standards of that season, this is a small fire. It is also the number one firefighting priority in the United States, because that other Washington fire, across 134,000 acres, destroys 44 structures. This one destroys roughly 700. One building lost for every 11 acres burned. Somewhere in 8 hours on a Saturday afternoon, a grass fire crossed a river everyone believed would stop it, climbed a bluff, and stopped being a wildfire at all, because the thing it was burning was no longer grass. It was a neighborhood. This is the story of the most destructive fire in Washington's history, and when the sun came up, it was still 0% contained. To understand how a fire that started in a field took a piece of an American city, you have to go back 4 years to water that never came. In early April of 2026, Washington State declared a statewide drought emergency. States declare droughts. What was not ordinary was that this was the 4th consecutive year Washington had done it. 4 years in a row is not a drought. 4 years in a row is a condition. And underneath that declaration sat one number that explains almost everything that came later. At the point in the calendar when mountain snowpack in the Pacific Northwest reaches its annual peak, Washington's snowpack stood at 52% of normal, just over half. In Oregon, one state to the south, it was 14%. Snowpack is not only water storage, it is a timer. As long as the spring melt is running, grasses stay green and dead material stays damp. When the snow runs out, the timer starts. Grasses cure, they finish growing, die back, and convert from green fuel that resists fire into standing dead fuel that carries it. In a normal year, that finishes in midsummer. That year, the clock started weeks early, and the window stayed open. Across eastern Washington that summer, fuel moisture, the water held in vegetation as a share of its dry weight, ran below normal all season and in places hit record lows. And the 4-year part is what made it different from one bad summer. A single dry year touches only the fine fuels, and those recover with one wet winter. 4 consecutive dry years reach the heavy material underneath that normally acts as a brake on how hot a fire can get. Give them 4, and they never get back to where they began. On Friday, July 31st, the National Weather Service issued something for eastern Washington that it had never issued for eastern Washington in the history of the office. It is called a particularly dangerous situation alert. The standard fire weather product is a red flag warning, and in eastern Washington in late July, those are routine. People who live there have seen dozens of them. The particularly dangerous situation tag sits above that, reserved for the most extreme combinations of fuel and weather forecasters can identify. Washington had never once used it. Russ Lane, the Wildland Fire Division manager for the State Department of Natural Resources, was blunt. With extremely dry fuels on the ground, he said, high winds on Saturday would create explosive fire growth that is rarely seen in Washington state. A Weather Service meteorologist named Joey Clevenger said the winds would peak around 8 in the evening in Spokane, gusting to 40 and 50. And then he said the thing that reads differently now than it did at the time. He warned that people living in town were not exempt, that mowing a lawn could throw the spark, that driving with chains dragging on the pavement could throw the spark. On Saturday morning, Governor Bob Ferguson declared a statewide wildfire emergency and imposed a burn ban through the end of September. He did that before a single one of the Spokane fires existed, not in response to them, in anticipation of something exactly like them on that specific day. He had already sent 110 National Guard members to fire lines, and the regional power company warned it might cut electricity to large parts of the region on purpose because it had read the same forecast and concluded that its own equipment was a hazard. Washington was not entering that weekend rested either. 10 large fires were already burning in the state, and roughly 4,000 personnel were already assigned to them. Every element of the warning chain performed, and then a fire started in grass at noon. The ignition point was near the intersection of Old Trails Road and West Euclid Road, north of the town of Airway Heights. On a stretch of open country, people there call the West Plains. Grass and brush, very little timber. Ground you drive past without registering, roughly 10 miles from downtown Spokane. The first size estimate was around 50 acres. 20 minutes later, it was around 100. Sit with that doubling, because it is the whole story of what came next. A fire that doubles in 20 minutes is not smoldering somewhere waiting to be noticed. It is running. And it was running because 3 conditions had lined up in a combination fire behavior specialists spend careers hoping not to see together. Winds gusting 35 to 45 miles an hour, relative humidity in the single digits, and fuel at record low moisture. State firefighting resources were mobilized by 1:30 in the afternoon. That is fast. That is the system working. It made no difference to the outcome, and the fire did not stay alone for long. Shortly before 4, a second fire ignited on the other side of the county and was named the Fairview Fire. Later that afternoon, a third broke out northwest of the first and was named Autumn Lane. 3 separate major fires, one county, one afternoon. By just before 3:30, Level 3 evacuation orders were going out inside the city limits of Spokane. Level 3 is written without any softening at all. Leave immediately. This may be your only notice. That phrasing exists because in a wind-driven fire, the window between being able to drive out and not being able to drive out is sometimes measured in minutes, and at that hour, the fire had not yet done the thing that turned a serious wildfire into a historic one. It had not yet crossed the river. There is a river between the West Plains and the neighborhoods of northwest Spokane. The Spokane River runs through the city, cutting a gorge through Riverside State Park. Basalt outcrops, ponderosa pine, and a suspension footbridge at a spot called the Bowl and Pitcher where thousands of people have stood and looked down at the water. If you have ever stood there, your instinct would tell you the same thing mine would. That is a firebreak. That is where it stops. The wind was out of the southwest, which pointed the fire directly northeast, and there was nothing between the ignition point and the park, but the same cured grass the fire had already proven it could move through. It went through the park, fast. Trees caught. Witnesses described flames standing above the treetops, visible from across the water. Then the fire raced down to the river, narrowly missed the footbridge at the Bowl and Pitcher, and crossed. Here is how a fire crosses a river, and it is not the way most people picture it. In light wind, a fire spreads by contact and by radiant heat, and that process is slow enough that a firebreak works. A road, a river, a bulldozed line, any gap wider than the radiant heat can reach will stop that kind of fire cold. Now put 45 miles an hour behind it. The flame front tilts hard forward, throwing heat almost horizontally into the fuel ahead, and the convection column above the fire becomes strong enough to lift burning material clean off the ground. That is called spotting. Bark plates, pine cones, chunks of burning grass, anything light enough to be picked up and dense enough to stay lit. They are carried up into the plume, pushed downwind, and they fall. If they land in fuel dry enough to accept them, they start a new fire, which merges back into the parent fire as it arrives, which strengthens the plume, which throws more embers further. A wind-driven fire does not advance as a line. It advances as a shower. That is why the river did not stop it. The fire never needed to burn across the water. It only needed to throw something burning far enough that it landed on the other side, and on that afternoon, on that bank, essentially every ember that landed was going to take. Long-range spotting has been documented carrying embers more than half a mile. The Spokane River Gorge is wide, and it is impressive, and against a fire throwing embers in a 45-mile-an-hour wind, it was a formality. Every person in that city carried a mental map of where fire could and could not go, built on features, the river, the park boundary, the big roads. It was a reasonable map, and it was correct in a normal year, and it was wrong on the 1st of August. When the fire crossed the water, thousands who had been watching a distant smoke column with detached interest went, in about a minute, from spectators to evacuees. They were not ignoring the danger. They were relying on a firebreak that had held their entire lives. Once it was across, the terrain worked against everyone. The neighborhoods of northwest Spokane sit on bluffs above the gorge. The fire had to climb to reach them, and a fire climbing a slope is a fire handed free acceleration. Heat rises, so flames moving uphill preheat the fuel above them far more efficiently than they would on flat ground. The fire had wind pushing it and slope pulling it at the same time. It burned uphill through the city's north side landfill and crossed West 9 Mile Road, which was no more of an obstacle than the river had been. And then it reached Indian Trail, houses, cul-de-sacs, an elementary school, a Catholic church on West Indian Trail Road, ordinary American suburban geography, sitting on a bluff backed up against open ground. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, flames and smoke were cascading over the trees beside the church. Some people had to drive past houses that were already burning to get down into the city. By 7:30 in the evening, homes around Indian Trail Elementary School were on fire, and the smoke had blotted out most of the sun. Reporters described home after home catching, along with the trees, and loud explosions audible through the smoke. Propane tanks, vehicle fuel tanks. When a wildland fire reaches a residential street, it is not encountering wood and brush. It is encountering a dense concentration of stored fuel and stored pressure, spaced 15 or 20 feet apart, in a geometry that lets each burning house ignite the next one. That is the uncomfortable fact at the center of this kind of fire. Past a certain point, the houses stop being the thing the fire is threatening and start being the fuel the fire is running on. The fire that took Indian Trail did not need the grass anymore. And the way most of those houses actually caught is not the way people imagine it either. The mental image is a wall of flame arriving at the front door. What investigators keep finding instead is embers. The same burning fragments that carried the fire across the river arrive at a house minutes to hours before the flame front does, and they get into attic vents, into gutters packed with dry needles, into the gap under a deck, into a woodpile stacked against a wall. The house then burns from a small ignition on or inside it, on its own schedule, often after the main front has already gone by. Which is why, in the photographs from the following morning, you see a pattern that looks impossible. One house gone to the foundation, the house beside it untouched. It is not random, it is the difference between a screened vent and an unscreened one. 60,000 people were ordered out of their homes inside Spokane city limits that day, and more than 65,000 were under evacuation orders across the wider area. Nearly all of it happened between about 3:30 in the afternoon and the middle of the night. Jason Lasko lives on 5 Mile Prairie, the residential plateau north of the city. When the first notice came, he was not especially worried. The fire seemed far off, and his instinct was to lock down the house and gather things. Then he saw how thick the smoke had become, got into his pickup, and headed east on Strong Road. Strong Road, he said, was completely gridlocked. He sat at a standstill for 30 minutes before police converted the whole road into 2 eastbound lanes. Gridlock in a wildfire evacuation is not an inconvenience. It is the mechanism by which these events kill people. In nearly every catastrophic wildfire that has produced mass casualties in the last decade, the deaths did not happen in houses. They happened in cars, on roads, in the gap between the moment people decided to leave and the moment the fire arrived. Monica Opfer lives near Indian Trail Elementary. She watched the fire come close enough that she could feel the heat coming off it. She grabbed her dog, Mabel, and her medication, and she went. After 8 that evening, she told a reporter that she thought she had lost her home and that she did not know where she was going to go. Nancy and Daryl Wagner, 73 and 76 years old, stood outside an evacuation center with their dog, Fritz, yapping in the grass beside them. Neighbors had already told them they had seen houses in the area burn. They had lived in that house for 31 years, Daryl said. And then Nancy added 5 words that may be the most devastating sentence anyone said out loud that weekend. Well, if it's still standing. That was Saturday evening, and neither of them knew. Bob Moore drove up Government Way trying to reach his own property and was stopped at a roadblock. "You got to let me go up there, man," he called from his truck window. "My shop, my house." The officer tried to find some way through, could not, and told him he was sorry. 410 families slept at the Spokane Convention Center that night. Kayla Sharp arrived at about 8:30 with her husband and their 6-month-old baby, looking specifically for a changing table. Sharp is 19, born in Spokane, and by her own account, used to fire season. "This one is different," she said, "because I have a child now." Assistant Spokane Fire Chief Lance Dahl said something that Saturday that deserves to be quoted in full, because it is not a deflection. It is a statement about physics. In a wind-driven event, he said, there is not a fire department in the United States that can handle a wind-driven event this size. Not this department. Not a department of this size. Any of them. None. Direct attack on a wildfire. Putting crews and engines at the head of it and stopping it there. Only works if people can move faster than the fire does. Every suppression tactic in the manual has a rate of spread beyond which it becomes a way to get firefighters killed. Past that ceiling, you defend what can still be defended, and you wait for the weather to change. Spokane put about 100 firefighters on duty that Saturday against a normal shift of 69. No staffing number, fixes a 45-mile-an-hour wind over fuel at record low moisture. What those 100 people actually did all night was structure protection, the house-by-house work of wetting a roof, pulling a woodpile away from a wall, and deciding in about 10 seconds which of the 4 houses on this block can still be saved and which cannot. And then the water started running out. Chief Dahl went on camera and asked residents to stop turning on their sprinklers. The city was already having problems with its water towers and its pumping capability, he said, because so much water was being used at once. A municipal water system assumes the city is not all doing the same thing at the same moment. Engines drawing from hydrants across an entire district, thousands of homeowners turning on hoses, Burned houses with open supply lines pouring water into nothing. Pressure drops. And when pressure drops in a hydrant network, the engines actively protecting houses lose their supply. There is no villain in that. Not one person watering a roof was doing anything unreasonable. Thousands of individually rational decisions added up to a collective failure, and the only tool available was to get on television and ask. Washington's adjutant general, with 38 years in uniform, said the conditions were the worst he had seen in his career. And then he said the sentence everyone in the region has been repeating since. When the sun sets and the sun rises, he said, we are going to be in shock. He was right, and the way in which he was right is the quietest and most devastating fact of the whole event. That night, 9 hours after the fire was first reported, officials could not answer basic questions. They could not say whether there were injuries. The sheriff, described by reporters in the room as red-faced and exhausted, explained that the situation was too dynamic to get an accurate count. But he gave the number he had. He had heard estimates from fire chiefs that around 50 to 100 structures may have burned. 50 to 100. At 6 o'clock the following morning, damage assessment teams began working the burn area. And the chief of Spokane County Fire District 3, the same man who had described the coming Saturday as the most significant fire weather event of the year, confirmed the figure for the Old Trails fire alone. 640 structures. Sit with the gap between those two numbers, 50 to 100, from the people closest to it at the end of the night. 640 at first light. That gap is not a measure of anyone's competence. Crews reported what they could actually see, and they could see almost nothing. The smoke had blotted out the sun by mid-evening, the power was out across the district, and every crew was committed to protecting houses and moving people rather than counting foundations. The gap measures how completely the event exceeded the ability of the people standing inside it to perceive it. That is exactly what the general had predicted. By Sunday morning it was worse still. The State Emergency Operations Center put the area total at roughly 700 structures, with about 5,000 more threatened, and officials were explicit that the count was preliminary. What the assessment teams found was entire blocks in Indian Trail and on 5 Mile Prairie burned down to their foundations. Not damaged, not partially lost. Foundations. And the other number had not moved at all. 0% contained. Here's the comparison that tells you what this event actually was. Roughly 700 structures destroyed across about 8,000 acres. One structure lost for every 11 or 12 acres burned. In the same state, in the same week, another fire had burned 134,000 acres and destroyed 44 structures, one for every 3,000. 8,000 acres was a small fire that summer. It was also the most destructive one in the country, and it was designated the #1 wildfire fighting priority in the United States. Because what makes a fire historic is not how much ground it covers. It is what is standing on the ground it covers. There was exactly one piece of good news that weekend, and nobody earned it. Sunday brought cooler air and lighter winds, and forward progress on 2 of the 3 perimeters largely stopped. That had nothing to do with suppression. The pause was not won. It was granted, and this was not the first time the county had been told. In August of 2023, 2 fires started north and west of Spokane on the same day. Between them, the Gray Fire and the Oregon Road Fire destroyed 710 structures, including 366 homes, and killed 2 people. The state's chief deputy fire marshal called them the most destructive set of fires Washington had ever experienced. That record took 5 days to build. Then, in the middle of June of 2026, the Upriver Fire burned just outside Spokane city limits, producing Washington's first wildfire death of the year. That was 6 weeks before Old Trails. 3 destructive fires, 3 years, 1 county. That is not bad luck. That is a place telling you what its risk actually is, repeatedly, in the only language it has. And there is one more detail, and it is the one I cannot put down. Candace Mumm is a former Spokane City councilwoman who evacuated from 5 Mile Prairie that afternoon. She told a reporter that the neighborhood had pushed for years to get a fire station built on the prairie. During her time on the council, the city actually bought the land for one. No money was ever set aside to build it. We always worried about this, she said. We kept being told it was not a priority. That is what the reckoning comes down to. The Old Trails fire was unremarkable while it was burning a state park. It became one of the worst disasters in the history of a region at the moment it reached the bluffs, where people live. What turned 8,000 acres into 700 destroyed buildings was not the fire's size or its speed. It was the arrangement of what was standing in its way, and the measures that address that are unglamorous and local and cheap by comparison. Cleared ground around a house, screened vents an ember cannot get into, a second road out of a hillside subdivision, and a fire station on land the city already owned. The state saw a fire coming with more precision than it had ever seen one coming, and did everything it knew how to do a full day in advance. and lost 640 buildings anyway. The wind was the only thing that stopped it, and the wind comes back. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this one. These documentaries take a lot of research and a lot of hours to put together, and if you found it worth your time, a like, a comment, or a subscribe helps more than you would think. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.